All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's Saturday LaRouche Pack class. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight Pat Ruckert is going to be bringing our discussion of classical drama and classical tragedy in a sense back home. This will be a continuation of a series of classes we've done on the importance of classical drama, and in particular classical tragedy, in terms of nourishing the qualities of deliberation which a citizenry of a great republic must have. Tonight we will be looking at one of the towering figures in the first half of the 19th century here in the United States, a towering figure both in terms of his artistry and in terms of his extraordinary political organizing activity, and that is James Fenimore Cooper. I personally found reading Cooper's novels, of which many of you may be surprised to find out there are over 40, since most of what is popularly available is the several volumes of the Leatherstocking Tales. But as I read more and more James Fenimore Cooper, I came to appreciate much more clearly the question of the principle of classical drama and classical tragedy. Because in our popular American culture, our idea of drama or tragedy is an entertaining story. And if it's a tragedy, maybe something bad happens to the people that you came to like in this entertaining story. That is not truly classical drama. The purpose of classical drama is to create in the mind of the audience an ability to look more deeply into what are the principles, what are the flawed axioms, which in many cases the characters in the play are not even aware of. What are these flawed axioms that are driving them, in many cases, often despite their best intentions, in the direction of disaster and in the direction of tragedy? Cooper has an extraordinary ability to do that in novels which in most instances took place here in the United States and were embedded in our own history, but in a number of extraordinary cases, which Pat's going to develop in the second part of this series, take place in Europe and give an incredible insight into the evil of the oligarchy and the flaws of a population which, if it's not ready to take on the oligarchy, is going to ultimately be doomed to a unfortunate fate. And this is so important today because we are in a period of tremendous transition. Anybody who's breathing has to know we're in very, very turbulent times with the danger of confrontation with the Russians being driven by the lunatics in our own administration today, with the ripping apart of our economy in terms of the inflationary insanities that are being pushed not only by this administration, but being pushed by the inherent failure of a central banking system. We're in a period of tremendous turbulence. It's causing tremendous political turbulence, as we're seeing, as the Trump movement moves forward in terms of demonstrating its growing power. It's truly safe to say that we are in the middle of a political revolution here in the United States. But and people are fairly conscious of what those battle lines are, at least in a preliminary way. So for example, when the Biden administration came out last week with its Ministry of Truth, or whatever its actual name is, the Department of Disinformation, the Bureau of Disinformation, something or other, which everybody has appropriately called the George Orwell Ministry of Truth. You know, it's not a big stretch to see that this is an effort by the elites to try and keep control by shaping public opinion and by trying to eliminate and squelch any opposite kinds of opinions. So people are fairly, certainly the politically active and in revolt layer of the population didn't have a whole lot of trouble seeing through that. Where the importance of classical drama comes in is that there are more fundamental ways in which patriots, whose intention is to make America great again, whose intention is to reestablish our sovereignty, are being fooled by in different ways. In other words, the propaganda and the public opinion shaping does not just come from CNN. It comes from Fox TV. It comes from Newsmax. It comes from Steve Bannon. And the clearest example of this is the way that most of those outlets, or at least most of the people on those outlets, with a few precious exceptions, are all in on this war with Ukraine, acting as if saving Zelensky and a bunch of Nazis in Ukraine is in the national interests of the United States. And I would really challenge people to think how many were taken in by that, perhaps, in the first several days or even weeks of the conflict in Ukraine. That question of whether people fall prey to public opinion or whether they have a firm grasp of what the fundamental principles of the fight in our nation and the world are, namely the principles of a republic versus the principles of an imperial or oligarchical system. That is what is going to determine whether or not well-intentioned patriots end up making the right decisions in this critical period of time. And this is something that James Fenimore Cooper was very, very clearly aware of, and carried out an unrelenting war throughout his career against the vagaries of public opinion, and throughout his writings sought to deepen that more fundamental understanding of what the nature of the fight is between the principles of a republic and the principles of an oligarchy. So I want to, before I turn it over to Pat, read a quote from Cooper by way of introduction. And I'm sure Pat is going to elaborate on this more as it gets more deeply into Cooper's history and to Cooper's outlook. But as I read this, this is something that Cooper wrote in 1938 called The American Democrat, which was written upon his return from several years in Europe. And he came back and found himself quite shocked at the degeneration of the American population from the previous generations which either had carried out the Revolutionary War or were in the immediately following generation. And he wrote, and as I read this, you can't help but think about today. He wrote, "Whenever the government of the United States shall break up, it will probably be in consequence of a false direction having been given to public opinion. This is the weak point of our defenses, of which the enemies of the system will direct all their attacks. Opinion can be so perverted as to cause the false to seem true, the enemy a friend, and the friend an enemy. The best interests of the nation appear to be insignificant and trifles of the moment. In a word, the right, the wrong, and the wrong, the right. In a country where opinion has sway, to seize upon it is to seize upon power." Now, we have seen a revolt against that up to a point, but it has to be deepened. And that really is the purpose of any great dramatist, of which James Fenimore Cooper was truly, truly an extraordinary one. And we're going to explore this over the next 2 weeks. Tonight, Pat is going to largely discuss James Fenimore Cooper's extraordinary life and political career. And in the second part of this, a week from today, he's going to take a look at two of the novels which were set in Europe and which are extraordinary examinations of the evil of oligarchy and the importance of understanding what drives the oligarchical systems so that we Americans, whether it was in the 19th century or in the 21st century, can understand more profoundly what the principles of a republic are. And I want to encourage people, as we did in the email that we sent out, to get yourself a copy of the Bravo. That one is a little easier to get a hold of. There's paperback copies available online. There's a free online edition, although I personally find reading 340 pages online a little trying, but perhaps that's just my generation. But I really encourage people to get a copy of this and dive into it, whether you finish it before next Saturday or not. It's going to begin to give you an extraordinary taste of the power of this great American hero, who, as Pat is going to describe, was attacked and has been belittled in our culture. Most people's acquaintanceship with James Fenimore Cooper is either a bad Hollywood movie or a cheesy, 30-minute TV show back in the 1960s, or just presenting him as some kind of adventure novelist. So I hope the discussion tonight and next week is going to open up a vast new vista of the power of this particular individual and one of the greatest classical dramatists, certainly of recent years. So Pat, go ahead.
Thank you, Susan. One correction, you said the quote is from 1938.
Oh, thank you.
1838. And in fact, it was 201 years ago, in 1821, that Cooper began to emerge as a significant personality, novelist, and political thinker. So we are in the bicentennial of Cooper's most significant period of his life. And to begin with, let me say a distinguishing feature of the United States and its history is that there is an absolute solid wall between our republic and all oligarchical cultures. And this is captured in the question of art, literature, etc., by Friedrich Schiller in his aesthetical letters written in the 1790s, where he said that the most perfect of all works of art is the construction of true political freedom. And with Cooper, that is what we will be discussing. Now, the highest expression of the principles of classical art in the United States is expressed politically. And not only through the founding documents of our nation, but through the work and the words of a few of our greatest leaders and statesmen. In an oligarchical culture, that is impossible. You find very few actual statesmen or stateswomen who do represent a cultural uplifting of their constituents, because these are empires where political control in one way or another is a tyranny, and that the population has no chance to be actually able to express important political and universal ideas. Now, that's not to say that great art in itself, separate from politics, that does express universal principles. has not been produced in the United States. It has, and we shall see some of that in our report. About, in the middle of the 15th century, more than 300 years before the United States Declaration of Independence, Nicholas of Cusa, a cardinal in the Catholic Church and a great philosopher, wrote that because mankind is created in the image of the Creator, every individual must be a central principle of government. That is the concern of government. And he developed in his writings the idea of representative government, a republic, which is the only form of actual representative government. And that the responsibility of the citizen for his nation, for his culture, is no different than that responsibility of those who actually lead. In the United States, the idea of representative government, in which elected officials are fundamentally no different than any other citizen, both having the responsibility for the future of the nation. And we see that as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and also in earlier work from those like Cotton Mather, or in the early years of Ben Franklin's activities, and how they express what is best and what must become the normal for all human society. The ideas expressed, for example, in the Declaration of Independence apply to all men and women at all times. In ringing poetical phrases like, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That does make the Declaration of Independence a true work of art. The preamble of the Constitution, too, grabs the reader's soul and hopefully implants in the mind the principal mission of the Constitution, such that, as was expressed by the Marquis de Lafayette, that the United States would become a temple of liberty and a beacon of hope for all mankind. The idea that there is a mission as the intent of the framers of this nation's institutions is the central characteristic that makes the United States exceptional. The individual in such a republic has the best opportunity to be able to express their real human quality, not like that of a dog who is born and dies, eats and procreates, never thinking of the future of dogdom or the past of dogdom or the well-being of his or her descendants. But for human beings, we think of the past, we think of the future, we act today to create that future. And that is what the founders of this nation actually had as their great artistic mission. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury, for example, in his 3 reports to Congress, establishing the American system as an anti-oligarchical, anti-monetarist credit system, and created with these reports and with the collaboration of President Washington, a true work of beauty with the establishment of the First National Bank of the United States, not a central bank, but one with a mission, not to manipulate money, but to build the physical capability of the nation to grow, to develop, and defend itself. John Quincy Adams, president from 1825 to 1829, utilized the Second National Bank of the United States to unleash the greatest economic progress that the country had ever had since its founding, and transform the relations among the people of the United States by bringing them together with railroads, steam engines, canals. That is what a great art must do. Change the people, their institutions, and to more perfectly reflect the unity of the nation and humanity for the higher purpose of creating even something better. Abraham Lincoln, through his uncompromising commitment to save the United States as, quote, the last best hope of mankind, not only ensured, as he said in the Gettysburg Address, quote, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And in so doing, Lincoln really became America's greatest poet. The Gettysburg Address unifies in just a few words the purpose of the nation and locates for every American that personal immortality in giving to the future, not only a nation intact, but a real connection to those whom in the past, quote, we can never forget what they did here. Lincoln's second inaugural of March 4th, 1865, toward the end of the Civil War and a month before Lincoln's assassination, is one of the greatest works of poetry any president or even any American poet has ever produced. Two short excerpts. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills, let it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. What he expressed there was the hope shared by all Americans at that time that the war will soon come to an end. And then he presents the challenge of what will be the nation's policy in the aftermath of the most destructive war in US history. What will that policy be? One of revenge, thus ensuring unending conflict and hatred? Or will it be, as Lincoln was determined it should be, a great step forward in the realization of the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and a new beginning for a completely new relationship among the people of the nation? Lincoln concludes that second inaugural with this: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. If the purpose of culture is not to entertain, but to be an expression of that which is best in mankind, and to reach deep into the soul and mind to evoke the spirit, which represents that unique quality every human being possesses, then Lincoln, like the others I have discussed here, through their political ideas and actions, are the real artists of the United States. And they have fulfilled Schiller's criteria of creating the most perfect of all art, true political freedom. So, who is James Fenimore Cooper? As Susan reported, if people are familiar with him at all today, it's because of 5 of the novels he wrote, put into one category called the leather stocking tales, with the lead novel being The Last of the Mohicans. And as Susan said, some TV shows, some usually abominable movies, especially the one 1992, which, as far as I'm concerned, the director, should be put in chains for that abomination that he actually created. But Cooper was born in 1789. He lived through the War of 1812, the development of the railroads, the development of the steam engine, and then the destruction of the American system by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. 62 years he lived, dying in 1851. And I'd like to actually give you a couple of quotations from Cooper and from others to give you a little significance of actually what he was, let me find it here, of how significant he was in the period in question. So here we go. Some may be familiar with the British author Charles Dickens and his novel, A Tale of Two Cities, which is a tale of the French Revolution that went off the rails. And Schiller, writing on it, said, "A great moment has found a little people." But the first sentence of Dickens' novel goes like this: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was an epoch of belief, it was an epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only." Dickens wrote that in 1859 with this extended contrast of opposites, which does echo Shakespearean type of tragedy, but it does take the reader's mind from the past to the present to the potential future and places them in history. Cooper, in his introduction to the Heidemower, written in 1832, 27 years before Dickens' novel appeared, wrote, and I'll just give a little bit of it because it goes on quite a ways, quote, "For a time we quitted Paris, the queen of modern cities, with its tumults and its order, its palaces and its lanes, its elegance and its filth, its restless inhabitants and its stationary politicians, its theories and its practices, its riches and its poverty, its gay and its sorrowful, its rentiers and its patriots, its young liberals and old illiberals. and its three estates and its equality. So it goes on, quite a ways with that. So I'm going to cut it off there. So as Susan said, Cooper has about 40 novels. And imagine, if you will, before not just computers, but even typewriters. And you had quill pens, or at best, pens you dipped in a little ink, and 40 novels in 30 years, right? So, but that's not all. Thousands of letters, hundreds of articles, and a magnificent history of the US Navy that still is today a reference work for the early years of the US Navy at Annapolis and in other institutions. Another tribute to Cooper by Charles Dickens is, for example, in Cooper's novel, Home is Found, he discusses a very disgusting journalist manipulator named Steadfast Dodge. And in Dickens' novel, Oliver Twist, he has a similar character. It's called Artful Dodger. Now, Cooper created the modern form of literature. He created the frontier adventure novel, the revolutionary adventure novel. In, for example, the American Revolution, The Spy, Lionel Lincoln. He invented the sea novels. No one had written a novel about battles between navies or pirates, but Cooper was the first, and there's 15 of those. Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick in the 1850s, 1860s, said without Cooper, he could have never written Moby Dick. Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Victor Hugo, all of them referenced and praised, and in fact, were inspired by Cooper. William Dunlap, the father of American theater and close friend of Cooper, dedicated his history of the American theater to Cooper. Cooper put the United States on the literary map. Walter Scott, the British author of feudalism worshiping novels, and as the British are wont to do, poured them into the United States and Germany in very cheap editions in order to undermine that revolutionary culture in the post-revolution, post-constitution period of the early 1800s. And Cooper began, as I said, writing novels in 1820, 21, and published the first novel, which was essentially a throwaway, done on a challenge from his wife, and imitated British cheap novels of the period, but then got serious. And the second novel was Spy, the first novel of the fighting and personalities of the American Revolution. And that novel took off, as we would say. Edition after edition sold out. And with a couple more novels over the next 2 years, by 1824, James Fenimore Cooper was the most widely read author in the world. He was translated into many languages: French, German, Spanish, Italian, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, Persian even. Right? And if Susan can pull up the first quote that we have from Notions of the Americans, 1829, when Cooper was in Europe. He went to Europe in 1826 and returned in 1833, 7 years in Europe. It was the Marquis de Lafayette, who Cooper worked very closely with while he was in Europe. They visited each other and they collaborated on many projects. But Cooper wrote, "The literature of the United States is a subject of the highest interest to the civilized world. For when it does begin to be felt, it will be with a force, a directness, and a common sense in its application that has never yet been known. If there were no other points of difference between this country and other nations, those of its political and religious freedom alone would give a color of the highest importance to the writings of a people so thoroughly imbued with their distinctive principles and so keenly alive to their advantage." Cooper went on to say that for half a century, America has been operating silently on Europe by force of example. But the time has now come for those authors familiar with America's doctrines and its experience to press these upon the world's attention with articulate expression. Books, he said, are in a great measure the instruments of controlling the opinions of a nation like ours. They are an engine alike powerful to save or destroy. And go to the next one, also from Notions of the Americans. He continued that the practical cares of life had held back real artistic development in America. Yet the talent is there, if it wants training and a push to bring it forth. The purely intellectual day of America is yet to dawn, and its faith and optimism in creating an American Renaissance was explicit. We live in the excitement of a rapid and constantly progressive condition. The impetus of society is imparted on all its members, and we advance because we are not accustomed to stand still. Our prosperity is owing to our intelligence, and our intelligence to our institutions. Every discreet man in America is deeply impressed with the importance of diffusing instruction among our people. Europeans may be reluctant to admit the claims of a competitor that they knew so lately, a pillaged, a wronged, and a feeble people. But nature will have its laws obeyed, and the fulfillment of things must come. The spirit of greatness is in this nation. Its means are within its grasp, and it is as vain as it is weak to attempt to deny results that every year is rendering more plain, more important, and more irresistible. Now, a couple more. The next one from the Paris Glove. This is 1827, reviewing one of Cooper's novels. Cooper portrays solitary heroes who exercise the height of human virtues and human potentialities. He shows us the promise of a new civilization in which laws are the guarantee of human liberty. In the pages of Cooper, we see the political revolution which made such a society possible, and we witness the progress of settlements which are bringing it to fruition. Unlike Walter Scott, who hides his lack of principles behind a ruse of objectivity, Cooper proclaims his faith in liberty, country, and the dignity of human nature. Cooper represents to the European reader the very type of noble American Republican. And one more from, again, the Notions. While Cooper is in Europe for 7 years, he traveled to Italy a couple times, Germany several times, and up north to Denmark and other countries. And on one trip to Germany, his guide at the point pointed out to him the birthplace of Friedrich Schiller in Marbach. And Cooper responded, quote, "Few men can feel of the interest that so commonly attaches to the habits, habitations, and personal appearance of celebrated men than myself. The mere sight of a celebrity never creates any sensation. Yet, I do not remember a stronger conviction of the superiority enjoyed by true over factitious greatness than that which flashed on my mind when I was told this fact, being shown Schiller's birthplace. That sequestered hamlet rose in a moment to an importance that all the appliances and souvenirs of royalty could not give to the palace of Ludwigsburg. Poor Schiller. In my eyes, he is the German genius of the age. Goethe has got around him one of those factitious reputations that depend as much on being a coddled celebrity. For you must know there is a fashion in these things that is quite independent of merit. Well, Schiller's fame rests solely on its naked merits. My life for it, that it lasts the longest and will burn the brightest in the end. The schools and a prevalent taste and the caprice of fashion can make Goethes in the dozens at any time. But God only creates such men as Schiller. Now, as the first generation of the American Revolution died away, the second generation, with Hamilton assassinated by British agent Aaron Burr in 1804, Washington had died in 1799, Franklin a few years before that, and the US government became a captive of what is best called the slavocracy. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, three more Virginians, all of them having had in their a role one way or another in preventing the US Constitution itself from actually outlawing slavery during the Constitutional Convention. And thus you had a certain deterioration of the intellectual and principled commitment to the foundations of this nation. And from the period of the assassination of Hamilton in 1804 until the ascension to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, two individuals really stand out as the great defenders of the United States principles, ideas, and real culture. Those were John Quincy Adams, the greatest Secretary of State the nation's ever had, president from 1825 to 1829, and then in 1831, entering the Congress only to leave, when he died in his seat in 1848. And at that time, for 2 years, a new one-term congressman worked with John Quincy Adams, especially in opposition to the US war against Mexico. And that congressman's name was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was thrilled, as one of his biographers stated, with the writings of James Fenimore Cooper. Now, Cooper grew up in Cooperstown, New York. Now, we have a map of where that is. At the time, his father created the settlement of Cooperstown in the early 1790s. Cooper was 2, 3, 4 years old at the time. The area north of, significantly north of New York, of New York City, was a complete wilderness. And a contest was going on of who was going to control this area up near the Canadian border, the Canadian colony of the British Empire. And there were British land companies attempting to grab up as much land as possible. And Cooper, William Cooper, Cooper's father, was fighting them and established a large settlement, not right then, but grew quickly, at Cooperstown. Now, Cooperstown today is known as the U.S. Baseball Hall of Fame, located there, but it has a much greater history than even baseball does. So that's Cooperstown. And William Cooper actually wrote books on how to create settlements in the wilderness. He was a 2-term congressman, a judge, and a real founder of the process of civilizing and developing the wilderness. So Cooper, as a young man, 17 years old or so, became a merchant marine 2 years as a sailor. And then in 1808, joined the US Navy, leaving it when he got married in 1811, a year before the War of 1812. But in the Navy, he made friends for life. Among them were men who became commodores, captains, and other high-ranking naval officials. And as he matured, he began to understand that the nation was deteriorating intellectually, culturally, politically. It was in the hands of the slaveocracy generally. He decided he had to save the nation. He had to participate and create a fight. And that's why he became an author. And in his trip to Europe for 7 years, 1826 to 1833, as I said earlier, he worked hand in hand with Lafayette. There was an upsurge of revolutionary activity throughout Europe, 1829 through 1833. And in 1830, a new revolution in France. Lafayette was the head of the National Guard. Cooper was in Germany when the real action broke out and hurried back to Paris. But it was too late. Lafayette, an old man now, remember he fought in the American Revolution, and this is now 1830, almost 50 years later. He flinched, to put it mildly, and he capitulated to allowing an oligarch, a royalty, Philippe, to become the new king. And Europe, having gone through the Napoleonic Wars and the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, a decade and a half earlier, was a real tyranny in all the nations. And the purpose of what was created then as an organization of certain European states called the Holy Alliance was to ensure that the horrible example of the United States, a Republican government, never is allowed to develop in Europe. And as an end intention It was to ensure that the United States would actually be extinguished. So Cooper, among other things, was financing other artists in Europe. Among them, he worked very closely with Samuel Morse. Now, maybe we should put up a few pictures here. Cooper, William Cooper, John Quincy Adams. That's William Cooper. There's James Fenimore Cooper. Okay. William Cooper. John Quincy Adams. And this is Lafayette as a young man. And here's Samuel Morse. Morse was an accomplished painter. He did portraitures to earn a living, and he was a contestant for actually painting the murals in the U.S. Capitol, but someone else got the job. So he's in Europe. He becomes close friends with Cooper. They're together all the time. And during this period, Morse is undertaking a very challenging painting called the Gallery of the Louvre. We put that up, and there it is, with some of the greatest works of art from Rubens, from Leonardo, from Rembrandt, are all pulled together in one room. And it took months for Morse to actually make this, complete this painting. And Cooper, for a period, would spend all afternoon talking to Morse. And in the lower left-hand corner, you see a man, a woman standing, and a younger woman seated. That's James Fenimore Cooper, his wife Susan, and his daughter Susan. So now Morse joined with Lafayette and Cooper and others like Samuel Gridley Howe to actually coordinate the revolutions throughout Europe. They would meet daily and receive delegations from Greece, from Poland, from Germany, from Italy. And it was a very revolutionary period. And essentially, Paris, the home of Lafayette and the home of Cooper, were the headquarters of European-wide revolutionary political Republican movements. But it was defeated by 1832, 1833, and Cooper, having also gotten reports from Peter Jay back home, who was the son of John Jay, a close family friend of the Coopers. John Jay, of course, was one of the co-authors of the Federalist Papers and the first Supreme Court Chief Justice of the United States itself. And Jay also was, during the Revolution, the coordinator of spies for George Washington. And it was through the discussions that Cooper had with the elder Jay that he developed his idea for writing his first best-selling novel, The Spy. So he returns home, he writes a letter to his countrymen. The attacks on Cooper become really serious. He wrote let's see, do we have that one attack on Cooper? While in Europe, 1830, 31, 32, Cooper wrote 3 novels on European topics: The Bravo, The Heidenmauer, and The Headsman of Bern, exposing and showing to the American people what an oligarchical tyranny actually was. And it wasn't really from the monarchy. It was from a growing financial oligarchy that had established the Bank of England, the central banks of Netherlands, and began spreading the idea that a nation's finances should be controlled only by rich and irresponsible bankers. So the Bravo, which we will discuss in some detail next week, was attacked in the New York American, but it was a reprint from a journal in Paris. And in a letter Cooper wrote to Samuel Morse, he said, "The Bravo is certainly no very flattering picture for the upstart aristocrats of the new regimes, and nothing is more natural than their desire to undervalue the book. But the facility betrayed by our own journals in an affair of this nation is a source of deep mortification to every American of right feelings." So the attacks on Cooper became more serious. Newspapers throughout the country, especially those controlled by the Federalist Party, attack after attack, slanders, complete inventions, much like is done and has been done with Lyndon LaRouche or even Donald Trump. But Cooper declared war on the press, and that's what it was called by the media or press itself, newspapers. And he sued them, and they'd slander him again, even about the suit and its outcome. And he won. He won another one and another one and another one. And he said that perhaps we can bring the press under the control of decency once again. And of course, he had a great description of newspapermen. He said, "Newspapermen are the fungus of letters who flourish on the dunghill of the common mind." And for the next near 20 years, novel after novel each year, 1839, the history of the US Navy. Cooper actually politically was a Democrat, but he said, "I am not a party man." And even though he gave somewhat support to Andrew Jackson, he was horrified by the culture that Jackson and Jacksonism had created in a hysterical, mass popular opinion to dismantle the American system, financial and banking system that the founding fathers had created. Initiated by doing so, in fact, set off the worst financial crisis in US history up till then, the crash of 1837. And so just a couple more words on his last work that was not completed because he died. It's called The Tales of Manhattan. And he said, among other things, that political parties is the most potent despot of our time. And it was the legacy of Cooper as Lincoln began to emerge as a new leader of the nation, that the German immigrants by the millions who had grown up with Cooper, they all read Cooper. And they came to the United States and they became the kind of citizens that Cooper spent his life attempting to create. On slavery and secession, Cooper was absolutely opposed to slavery. For most of his life, he had no idea what the hell could be done about it. But toward the end, in his introduction to the Tales of Manhattan, he said, we're heading for a split in the nation and perhaps a civil war. And in that, not only does he express his opposition to slavery, but is also his opposition to those who were attempting to destroy the nation because slavery was tolerated. Cooper on secession said it's unconstitutional, and if any state attempts it, it should be crushed. So with that, we will bring this to a close, and next week we will then discuss the Bravo and the Heidemeyer. Okay, thank you.